Then I can't speak for Indian cities or Chinese cities, but in terms of population, the largest city in Western Eurasia by a long margin. And it's certainly the second biggest was Constantinople, and that may have had a population of 100,000, but probably less at this stage. So we're talking about a real phenomenon here. And I'm wanting to try to explore some ideas today about the way this affects, well, how this can be, and the way that it affects the economy and the rather sort of ambitiously called globalization of Baghdad. The tentacles of the demand in the Baghdad economy reach out well beyond the boundaries of Iraq, well beyond the boundaries of the Muslim world. And I want to talk firstly about the economic background to it. Let's just so here is sort of familiar to you all, a map of the rough outlines of the Umayyad Caliphate, or at least the Caliphate which the Abbasids inherited in 750. Just to give you a context of the wide scope of it there. And the first point I want to make is the nature of the Baghdad economy and why it becomes so big. Then I want to talk about how Baghdad was fed. And then I want to talk about, in the third part of this lecture, I want to talk about how demand in Baghdad generated this much wider trade, much wider source of trade. In the aftermath of the Arab-Muslim conquest of Iraq, a settlement was made by the first caliphs, and I believe that this really does date back to the reign of Umar ibn Khattab, the second caliph. And the fundamental principles were established there in Iraq, which is where most of the Arab-Muslim conquerors settled, and was then rolled out, as it were, to other areas of the Arab-Muslim, the emerging Arab-Muslim world. And this was the well-known function of the Diwan, that the lands of the conquered were not divided up amongst the conquerors, which is a fundamental importance and fundamentally different from the settlements that were made in, say, Western Europe after the Germanic conquests of the 5th century, when basically the lands were granted out to people to establish lordships and so on and so forth, and the state really didn't have any existence in this society. On the contrary, that in Iraq and in the wider Middle East, the caliphs were repeatedly told in the tradition that it was Umar who decided this policy, and I'm inclined to accept this as a valid hypothesis, refused to do that. And because if that was done, then what would happen to the next generation? And the generation after that, who wanted to join in the Muslim enterprise at this stage, there would be nothing left for them because it all gone. And so the argument was that instead of that, taking over the land, the existing inhabitants by and large would continue to till the soil and continue to do all of the work, basically. And they would pay taxes to the rulers, and these taxes would be redistributed as either a pension or a salary. And I could talk a lot about the distinction between these things, but I won't because time is too short. But this meant that the taxation was collected, counted, and paid out to people whose names appeared on lists as the beneficiaries of this taxation. And these lists were called the Diwan. And so the Diwan system was set up. This meant that the early Islamic state was the only polity post-Leidenuniv Eurasia, post-Persian post-Rome, that maintained a system of public taxation. And this is a fundamental importance to understanding the whole dynamics of not just of the economy, but the political dynamics of the early Islamic state. Furthermore, in the first generation, there was some evidence, or some evidence of payment, particularly in documents like the Sons of Al-Buldān, of the local people actually paid taxation in stuff, in kind. That is to say, they may have paid their taxation in oil and in grain and so on. By the year 710, 720, at the latest, this has largely disappeared. Taxation was paid in coined money. And this is, it makes it a very different thing from paying, carrying a harvest to the neighbouring tribe and consume it in that way. It was paid in coined money, in gold dinars, but above all in silver dirhams. And we're informed about vast numbers of silver dirhams that were transferred from one place to another, the records of taxation. So it's paid in coined money. And this is a number of knock-on effects which are so important. The first is, obviously, you have to have a machinery for coining the money. From the time of the Caliph Abdul-Malik, certainly from almost exactly the year 700, the Muslims made their own very distinctive sorts of coinage. They made their own distinctive coinage with no images, but with the inscriptions on them, which made a completely different appearance to the money. But if you're going to operate a system like this, you also need bureaucrats. You also need people who are numerate and literate. They can add up and read and write. And if you don't have such people at your disposal, then you simply can't run a system like this, because nobody knows how much is owed, nobody knows who's been paid, who ought to be paid, and so on and so forth. It's an obvious point, but actually very important for the emerging Arab Muslim civilization, because unlike, again, Western Europe or the Byzantine world, it means you have a large class of literate and numerate laymen. They're not affected by, they're not part of any religious institution, they don't have any religious status or anything. They're lay people who are employed as bureaucrats, and they are, in fact, paid salaries, like the military whose names were listed on the D1. So these people were paid salaries. And they form a very important class. They form a very important class in the generation of Arabic Muslim culture. And in particular, the generation of that secular literature, which is so characteristic of Abbasid period, whether it be poetry, history, geography, or anything like that, the non-religious literature. But I don't want to go down that route particularly at the moment. Now, the payment of salaries to large numbers of people Whether they really were as much as 500,000 in Baghdad or less is open to dispute. But the payment of salaries to this very large number of people, of course, creates a demand in the economy. For these soldiers and the people who flock to the new Abbasid capital of Baghdad, whether as soldiers or bureaucrats or people trying to offer goods and services of all sorts, were not by and large farming their own lands and living off their own backyards, because there simply were too many in one place to make that possible. They had to attract resources of food and other things from way around the Middle East. But there's another element that's coming into play here too, and that is recent research, particular research from Maya Schatzmiller and a number of publications has argued, and I think quite forcefully, I think we can pick away at the details of it about Schatzmiller's argument, that this was a period of rising real wages. She argues that the great pandemics, here we are again, the great pandemics of the 6th century had reduced the population. Now, pandemics are bad news. I mean, I don't know about this before this point anyway, but they're basically bad news, particularly for people who die. But for the people who survived the pandemic, and here the comparative evidence comes from the Black Death in Western Europe, 1948, 1949, the people who survived the pandemic, for them, standards of living tend to rise. And there's lots of evidence that standards of living of, as it were, peasants and townspeople in Western Europe rose after the Black Death. And it wasn't also in Islamic, because the Black Death came back on a number of occasions, but there is a general tendency for living standards to increase. And for instance, villeinage, serfdom disappears in Western Europe in the aftermath of the Black Death, because people have to be paid and rewarded for working in a way that they didn't have to when there were more of them before. So this means, if Schatzmiller's right, then it means that the increased demand and the increasing spending power that was around in the Islamic period was not just an elite operation, that it was much more widespread in society than in many other pre-modern societies. If you've never heard of the Israeli village of Nahal Omer, don't worry, it's not a reflection of your ignorance. It's the fact that very few other people have either. Nahal Omer lies on the edge of the Wadi Arava in southern Israel in a very, very dry area. And it's a real bucket and spade village, and nobody went there, nobody came from there, nobody writes about it. But recent excavations have revealed a very interesting thing. In the garbage tips and the ruins of the houses of Nahal Omer, we find traces of textiles that are silks from India. The earliest recovered ikat, textiles of sort of the characteristic of Central Asia now, seem to come from Nahal Omer. Now, if imports of high quality textiles had reached this small village in the south of Israel, then by extension, then they would have visited lots of other places as well. It's extraordinary penetration that we get of foreign imports into geographically and socially is remarkable. So let's look at the demand that is in the economy, the latent demand that's in the economy here. And the most important thing, of course, is that people need to eat. And if we've got 500,000 people, most of whom would like to have one meal a day, just kind of minimal, then this is a huge operation, bringing food to these people. Now, if you look in the libraries and so on, you will find volumes about the food supply of ancient Rome and how it was organized, how the Anono convoys took the grain of Egypt and it was distributed free to the people of Rome. You'll find smaller volumes, and fewer of them, about the food supply of Constantinople, particularly in the period before the Arab Muslim conquest. If you look through the literature for any discussion of the food supply of Baghdad, you will draw an almost complete blank. This is a problem which historians have not recognized or addressed. And I think that it has interesting consequences or interesting applications. Sorry, I'm having to do this with the arrow. And this leads me on to looking at the, as it were, the breadbasket of Baghdad. Where did the food come from? And I'm talking here, therefore, about a concept which I'm calling Greater Mesopotamia. And Greater Mesopotamia, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I'm arguing, involves most of the modern Republic of Iraq. In fact, all the modern Republic of Iraq, except the very desert bits to the west. But it also involves a lot of northern Syria, particularly the area of the Jazeera and around the Euphrates there towards the mountains of Turkey. And it involves right in the southwest, which I'm in the southeast, right in the southeast, it involves the area of Khuzestan, now in Iran, but an area which shares much of the morphology and the geographical features of the wider Mesopotamian plain in terms of rivers running down from the mountains and being diverted for agricultural purposes. And Greater Mesopotamia becomes an economic system. Now, before the Arab-Muslim conquest, Greater Mesopotamia was divided roughly along the modern Syrian Iraqi frontier, actually, but roughly divided between the Sasanian Empire, Sasanian Persian Empire in the west, in the east, and the Roman Empire in the west. And that meant, crucially, in terms of urban development, that much of the middle Euphrates area was a war zone. But even more, that it was impossible to import large quantities of foodstuffs from the grain-growing areas of the Syrian Jazeera to the cities of Lower Iraq, i.e. the predecessors of Baghdad. The coming of the Muslim conquest broke down these trade barriers. They meant that people could grow food in northern Syria and export it to the cities of Lower Mesopotamia, i.e. the cities around Baghdad and to the south. Now, how do we know that this is going? Well, we hear reports again in the chronicles, but there has also emerged a substantial amount of archaeological survey evidence, almost ironically, the best from Syria, which until 2010 was an area where you could, with diplomacy and persistence, conduct wide surveys of agricultural the use of agriculture and the use of rural settlement. That's just a couple of pictures. Here is the River Euphrates as it exists today on the Syrian-Iraqi border. It almost looks like aerial photographs of the Nile. You've got a very narrow band of cultivated land around the river and then deserts on either side. But the historical and archaeological record presents a rather different picture. And the key to what I'm trying to argue here, this is the River Tigris. This is just a picture, a pretty picture, so to speak. But the area that the Fertile Crescent, then Syria and the areas north of Baghdad, is characterized by the fact that wide areas of land, which can, in some circumstances, be the centers of agricultural settlement, villages and small towns, and even isolated farmsteads. But in other circumstances, are given out as pastoral, if you like, Bedouin, but it's a kind of difficult term, but Bedouin tribesmen. That is, there's a lot of area which can be pastoral and very underutilized or can be intensively farmed. What determines whether it's going to be intensively farmed? Well, it can be intensively farmed if there is a guarantee of at least a reasonable amount of peace. Because villages and isolated farms are very vulnerable to invading armies, marauding groups, and so on and so forth. If you've got a peaceful establishment, then it's worth going out and digging the fields. becoming a pastoralist, becoming a Bedouin, so to speak, gives you many more options in times of insecurity. Because clearly, if you're growing crops and trees and fruit trees and things like that, you can't just uproot them and take them away if somebody invades. But if you're living off camels and sheep, then you can. Yeah, the Bedouin lifestyle gives you, in many ways, a lot more assets and options in times of insecurity, but in times of security, then becoming an agriculturalist may offer more in terms of rewards, more reliable food supplies, and so on and so forth. So large areas which can go one way or the other, depending on the circumstances. And the other thing that you need in order to, or that settled people need, is a demand for agricultural produce. You don't just go digging loads and loads of fields just because it's good exercise. You do it because you're producing things that people want to consume. And this creates the, as it were, the virtuous circle, where demand in the city means that people invest in digging different agriculture, doing different sorts of canals, bringing into cultivation lands that would not be brought into cultivation if this demand didn't exist. And this is written all over the archaeological landscape of northern Syria and northern Iraq and central Iraq as well, in the areas of the Diyala River basin and so on. And so what we get is that the demand, which is generated by the salaries paid to the people in Baghdad and the people who work for the government, results in agricultural expansion of settlement through a very wide area that goes way beyond the capital. Now, the other thing, of course, that you need is some way of getting all this stuff from the fields of the northern Jazeera, northern Syria, to the markets in Baghdad. And here, water power is absolutely essential. Water transport is absolutely essential. Now, there's been a lot of good work done on the Nile in Egypt as a means of transporting goods. There's been almost no work done on the rivers of the Fertile Crescent and the central, what we could call the Mashriq, the Eastern Islamic world, as ways of moving stuff. And yet it was clearly very important. And we get little isolated anecdotes and so on in the chronicles. But nobody sat down, it seems to me, and wrote a treatise on water transport in the Mashriq. Or if they did, it's been lost and gone forever. We can get a certain amount from accounts, particularly of British engineers trying to work out in the 19th century, when access to India was so important, trying to work out whether you could run boats down the Euphrates. And the answer was basically no. Not big iron boats of the sorts they were thinking about, steamships and so on. What you could do, and what there's ample evidence for from the 19th century, is you could run, you could use much smaller craft, which if they ran aground on any of the shoals in the Euphrates, you could push off and carry on. Let's just have a look at the rivers a bit here. Sorry, I'll just go back to that one. This is the Euphrates, in contrast to Tigris we've just been seeing. You will see this view from the escarpment, which actually I took in the 1960s. Things have been developed a lot since then, I imagine. Things have been destroyed a lot since then, probably more the point. With the escarpment, the fairly narrow but intensively cultivated lands along the river. And you can cultivate these lands because people dig canals that run not by the river, but run on the bottom of the escarpment. You then lead off from these canals, feeder canals, which take the water from the main canal along the bottom of the escarpment through the riverine fields that we see there looking so green and so on, down to the river itself. It's an agricultural system that can be very productive, but it requires investment and hard work on a regular basis. This is the River Khabur, the biggest tributary of the Euphrates on the northern side. Not very impressive, is it? And yet we've found the archaeological record shows that the waters of this rather dismal looking stream are in fact very productive. And even more extraordinary, we know from 10th century travellers that people were sailing down this stream from one village to another on boats. You know, but just think about it for a moment. But it all becomes more real if we start looking at more recent images of boats. Here we are in the marshes of southern Iraq. As this small canoe is carrying a great mountain of vegetation, and we have a lively riverine scene. Here we are, the little round boats are called kiliks nowadays. I'm not sure whether they really existed as such in the Abbasid period. The names of ships are very difficult to relate to modern ships. And here, a final version of the river at Basra and so on. There are a lot of shallow draft crafts that we're using. And the great beauty, in the sense of this system, was that you built the rafts upstream, and where you could get timber from the mountains of Turkey or from the Amanus or wherever. You built them there, you loaded them with stuff, grain and so on. You sold them down to Baghdad, and when you got to Baghdad, not only did you sell the grain, but you also sold the boats, which were broken up and used for building and so on in an area where there wasn't very much timber. But again, it all depends on these two variables of security and demand, people who want the stuff. So and I could talk equally about the way in which goods are moved up the river, particularly dates and sea fish are moved up from Basra in the south to Baghdad as well, because the rivers of the south don't rush along like the Euphrates and the Tigris do. They're much more tranquil, and you can actually move boats upstream and so on. So you've got the land that can be farmed in the right circumstances. You've got the boats that can move the stuff around, and this seems to be what's happening and how the great city gets supplied. It's nothing to do with the government. There is no equivalent of the Roman administration organizing the Annona, policing the Annona, making sure enough grain is coming from Egypt. We don't hear anything about this at all. It seems to be basically a private enterprise operation. It's a supply and demand operation. That means that this isn't an Oriental despotism model. It means that people all over the greater Mesopotamia see it in their interest to farm and sell goods from their lands. But it isn't just only the one meal a day or however many meals people are wanting that we find. Let's get back to Schatzmüller's model of lots of people with disposable income. Early Abbasid society was a very consumerist society. From reading lots of books, you may think they were only interested in religious law and things like that. And so on. But reading more widely, it's absolutely clear it's a very consumerist society. You demonstrated your status by having stuff and showing it off. And the basic rule was the more rare and exotic stuff you had, the more it contributed to your status. So if you imported things from a very long way away and you had your friends around to admire them, then that was a very important thing. So what sort of things, what are the consumer goods that people really wanted? Well, they wanted, above all, fancy textiles, beautifully woven silks, extravagantly decorated clothes. And we have lots and lots of descriptions of textiles, carpets, wall hangings, and so on. We have almost nothing in terms of physical survivals. These little bits and pieces, ironically, perhaps all these, but a number of the most important ones are in Western European cathedral treasuries, because they were preserved as exotica, a wonderful exotica. They were used to do that most precious of things, wrapping up the bones of saints to preserve them and give them the status they felt they would deserve. But the textile industry was certainly the biggest industry in the early Islamic Middle East, and it's the one that has left fewer traces. So the textiles came from far and wide. But an important element of textiles is dyestuffs, because it's dyestuffs that give you the all these fancy colours, apart from gold thread and so on. But dyestuffs come from a very wide area of well. Nowadays, of course, dyestuffs are made chemically, and you can make any sort of colour you want in a laboratory and so on. But until the 19th century, this is not true. If you wanted to get certain sorts of colours, you had to source goods from a very wide variety of places. And some dyestuffs, like indigo, Neil in Arabic, were almost an alternative currency in some societies. If you wanted to get crimson, you had to send to Armenia, right in the Caucasus, because that's where the beetles were, and the beetles you crushed to produce a crimson dye. You couldn't get it anywhere else. So you can see how dyestuffs for these textiles generate a pattern of trade. And the textiles of Armenia were famous for their workmanship, but also for their thing. They come from different areas. Spices and cloves. Again, spices are sort of almost proverbial about medieval trade, but they're very important. There again, they can only be sourced in certain areas. Take cloves, the humble cloves that you put in apple pies and so on. Until the 19th century, the only place in the world where cloves were grown on really surprisingly large trees, if you look at them. The only area where cloves were grown was 2 islands in the Indonesian archipelago. In the 19th century, cloves become transported to Zanzibar, and clove production becomes located there. But for that's where you had to get them for. And yet, there are cloves mentioned in Baghdad cookbooks and so on during this period, that even cloves in Western Europe. That didn't mean that any Muslim merchant actually went to these islands, or not, but they did, they didn't tell us about it. But it meant that there was this pattern of trade. And so we see here the way in which demand in Baghdad, the tentacles of demand extended right as far as the Far East. Let's consider another thing, rock crystal. Rock crystal is a quartz-like stone which can be, with great labour and skill, transformed into vessels and jars that look almost as if they're made of glass, but they're harder and more resilient. Now, rock crystal is known in Baghdad. It is the greatest rock crystals come from, in fact, from Egypt in the 10th and 11th centuries. But it appears that a lot of the rock crystal, but not all of it, comes from the island of Madagascar. So people in Madagascar are quarrying rock crystal and exporting it to the Gulf and then up the Red Sea. And interesting, again, we see the economic tentacles of the Baghdad economy extending to areas way beyond the boundaries of the Muslim world in this way. But the best examples, and some of you may be familiar with some of you, are the ceramics. Sorry, I'm doing it the wrong way. Sailing in ships like this reconstruction of the Balādhurī shipwreck, which the Balādhurī shipwreck is a startling piece of archaeology. It's not uncontroversial to people. Some people say it's not one thing or whatever. But the Balādhurī shipwreck was a ship that went down in shallow water off the coast of Java. This is presumed rigged from round to China. Now, there are 2 things that are remarkable about the Balādhurī shipwreck. Well, lots of things are remarkable about the Balādhurī shipwreck. But it had on board some 60,000, that is 60,000 pieces of Chinese ceramics. Now, these ceramics are tableware. If you put them in the dishwasher, they scrub up nicely, so to speak. There they are as discovered, and there they are as cleaned up. And they, we know a variety of things about them. Firstly, there's 60,000 of them, which is a huge number. Secondly, that they're made in China, and they're made in inland China. But they're being carried on a boat, and all the indications from the timber and the technique of the boat suggests that the boat comes from the Gulf. i.e. it's a boat built and constructed in the Gulf that had been sailing to China, picked up a load of the stuff, and was sailing back probably to the Gulf. It's probably coming back to Iraq. It's probably there to feed the demand for this sort of ceramics in Baghdad and other places. Now, and the Balādhurī shipwreck sank in about 830 at the height of the prosperity of Baghdad. So we see here actually, if the arguments are correct, and as I said, some people say, oh no, it's not, the wood comes from somewhere else and so on. As you can imagine, there's a certain amount of archaeological kalam and discussion about this sort of thing. But the reality is that there it is, and the preponderant view is that it's exactly what it looks like. It's Chinese ceramics being imported in very large numbers to the Gulf. And if you've got 60,000 of these plates, then they have a fairly wide distribution in society. They're not the very finest porcelain. They're not the real classy see-through porcelain that people really value so highly. But they are tableware. They're not things that you use for carrying jars of wine or whatever you're going to use them for. They're tableware, and they suggest, now this is getting into controversial areas, they suggest a sort of wide, if you like, middle-class professional people, bureaucrats, and shopkeepers and so on, who have the disposable income to provide a demand for these things. And so what I'm arguing and suggesting is that the emergence of a city of the size of Baghdad has a profound impact on the wider economy, on possibly the global economy. Things come from Western Europe, rather discouragingly, apart from swords, Frankish swords, were widely valued. What was imported from Western Europe was largely slaves. And it was because white slaves were highly valued for all sorts of things, but we don't need to go into. But if we look east and south, we can see how the economy of Baghdad, the demand generated by the economy of Baghdad, penetrated way beyond the boundaries of the Muslim world. So there is a sort of, this comes back to my title, a sort of proto-globalization going on here, which I think has very important consequences in literature, for example, in the sort of fantasy tales that you get, the Sinbad the Sailor narratives and so on, which it can be argued are partly for entertainment, but partly to drive up the price of exotica, sorry, that's a simple time that I didn't mean to make. Driving up the prices of exotica and making them seem more attractive and making the getting of them seem more dangerous. But perhaps the most important, or one of the most important consequences of this globalization is the adoption of paper and the techniques of paper manufacture from China and so on. But that is another story, and I have to wait for another time. But this is like all booms, and it had a bust after it. By the 10th century, the population of Baghdad is in free fall because political events have meant the military takeover of the public finances, of the direct military takeover of the public finances, the way in which the various provinces moved off, and in particular, it saw a renewed trade barrier. Sorry, there's a bit more of this about it. So, a renewed trade barrier between Syria and Iraq and lower Iraq, because the northern Syria was held by dynasties, particularly the Hamdanis, who were deeply hostile to the rulers of Baghdad. The coming together of a common market, which had made in Greater Mesopotamia, which had made the whole of this precocious trade system work, was dissolved by this. Baghdad shrinks. It doesn't disappear, but obviously it's still there today. But Baghdad shrinks from this megalopolis of the 8th and 9th century to a regional capital of some importance. But the real economic, the shift of economic power moves away from central Iraq. It moves away above all to Cairo, but also to a lesser extent to the cities of northern and eastern Iran. But while the Baghdad economy thrives in ways I've tried to describe to you, then it has a global reach that I think profoundly affected the way people looked at the world, the things people wanted to pay money for, and their knowledge of many wider cultures than their local Baghdad environment. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave it there. It's been a bit of a romp in the sense of trying to get a lot of ideas and a lot of information across. But I'd be very interested, obviously, in any questions that people have to ask, or people want to ask.
Thank you very much. So we have indeed time for questions. So please, anyone who wants to ask something.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I have actually something to share and maybe a question as well. I'm from Al Jazeera, this area in Syria, and we still it's so like fascinating how it's named. Thank you so much.
Can you speak English?
Oh.
Just speak up. Just speak up.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's so fascinating that because we still have until 2013 those nomadic and Bedouin tribes. We call them Shamar. We had this in my childhood. We had this stereotype that they always work in transferring goods from Syria to Iraq. And they start always yelling when they sell their products, like this is from the middle of Baghdad. And then I was wondering, like, is this the same group of people that used to work for the Abbasid from that era?
The answer to that is it's impossible to tell, but the people occupying the same ecological niche, if you like. But whether they're direct descendants of the same people or not is very difficult to tell. But they're fulfilling the same role in the ecology of commerce and agriculture. Yeah.
It's so fascinating how it's related to. Thank you so much.
Just stand up.
Is it working?
Yeah.
So you said that in the 10th century, Baghdad basically got relegated to a regional capital, so it lost its global importance. But I still got the impression there was a bit of global trade going on. So what happened after the Mongolian conquest, where they just the entire city blinked out of the world map?
Well, Baghdad had ceased to be a world trade center long before Mongol conquests. Already by the 10th, 11th century, it had become a major local center, but not on the scale that it had before. And the population gone down to maybe 30,000, 40,000, from perhaps a tenth of the amount that it was in the early Abbasid period. So this change is not something that comes with the Mongols. It's something that's been going through the system for at least 200 years.
Thanks.
And Baghdad, of course, remains always being part of the genius of Japan and so on, that he chose this site. And unlike so many newfound capitals in the Middle East and elsewhere, artificial capitals, Baghdad continues to exist because of its strength is one of the rivers coming together.
Thank Thank you so much, Hugh. I was thinking, you said several times that the economy of Baghdad penetrated the rest of the world, even outside of Islam. But the examples that you provided us were more about the rest of the world entering Baghdad. I was wondering, does this middle class, level population, high wage population also produce something that the rest of the world consumes? Is there any evidence for that?
Not much. I mean, the model I'm suggesting sees Baghdad as essentially a consumer society. Now, this is clearly not entirely the case. Lots of things were made in Baghdad, but what's interesting is not the local things that were made, so it's the emphasis on goods coming from very long distances away, and exotic goods coming from very long distances away, and foodstuffs coming from very long distances, comparatively long distances away as well. Certainly things were made in Baghdad. We have lots of records of textiles that were made in Baghdad and so on, which is what you'd expect. But what is different and what marks why it's called globalization. I mean, you're absolutely right, I'm talking about the world coming to Baghdad rather than Baghdad going to the world. But what I'm talking about also is the demand in the economy is going to the rest of the world, or to all these areas we're looking at. And that is a sort of globalization. But I chose the title globalization partly because it captures the imagination of it. If I just said a lecture on the growth of trade in medieval Baghdad, lots of people would decide they've got better things to do with their afternoon. In fact, you have to say to talk these things up a bit.
That's fine, I'm not. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Wonderful to hear your lectures. I wonder if you could perhaps help those of us who work on intellectual history or the history of ideas, why in the 8th, 9th, 10th century, even 11th century, Baghdad continued to attract scholars, jurists, theologians from all over. Ibn Nadim and his famous catalogue of books tells us a number of stories in the 11th century or late 10th century, how Persian traders, Greeks would come to Baghdad and they would snap out the best books and sort of steal the best translations of late ancient Greek wisdom. What was going on if this Baghdad continued to be a significant scientific capital well into the 10th century? Why is there a disconnect that seems really going decline and the intellectual activity?
Well, that's a very interesting question, to which I don't entirely know the answer. But I think there were legacy issues here, in the sense that there were libraries that were set up in Baghdad that still continued to exist. And it was still a big city. I mean, it's just not the city it had been in terms of the economic outreach. But also, of course, Baghdad is really important because people coming from Iran on the Hajj pass through, not always, but many of them pass through Baghdad. So people who were religious scholars from, I don't know, Nishapur, Marif or Isfahan would come through Baghdad, and they brought with them their collections of hadith, their collections of traditions and so on. And I think that was something that, that were not completely linked to the economy, but certainly brought people to Baghdad, and it's the, the movement of knowledge is part of that reason. But Baghdad was, throughout its history, ever since its foundation, it's been a regional capital of central Iraq, for sure. And so I'm not saying that it completely disappeared. I am saying that we didn't function in the way that it had done at all.
Might as well take it and shout that loud.
It would be nice also for the audience.
Okay, thank you, Hugh. I'll join everyone's thank you for your talk and emphasize it. So just a couple of things from Ihab's point, and Cecilia, the idea of the exports from Baghdad. I guess one thing is kind of intellectual and literary, right? There's a kind of a construction of an Arabic global culture that does go everywhere from Baghdad. So I think the books going out and this sort of homogenization of kind of Arabness The other one, I just on the point on the Chinese pots, there is in poetry already from the 8th and early 9th century, the word sini is used to mean white. So they are kind of a good example, something, if you want to say something is a really nice type of white, then you would use the word Chinese. So I think that helps the idea that there's all this pottery kind of going in because it becomes kind of an oracle word. But and I just want to ask with a question on the importance of the security for the prosperity of the town. I mean, it's very easy to sort of look at collapse of regimes and borders coming put up, but traders and businessmen are pretty good at getting around that, and also in the middle of that very highly prosperous period, we did destroy Baghdad one time. I mean the people who were there, right? The city was sacked during the fourth fitna, and it's it comes back pretty fast. And that seems to be a more serious problem for Baghdad than even in the 10th century, when you still get sort of references to lots of traders coming. And I sort of see this from looking up stories about robbers, outlaws, and bandits who are sort of still, there's clearly a lot of lucrative trades going up and down the river, even when the Buyids and Hamdans are fighting. There is enough there to support enough robbers to make a living out of stealing.
That's interesting, and you're certainly right about the senior business as well. The answer is that I suppose it's rather sort of that things don't come to a complete full stop. You still get this trade. What I'm saying is that the Hamdanis particularly, as evidence of them using a sort of economic warfare against Baghdad, and it's from the time when the Hamdanis break away from the Abbasid Caliphate and are actively hostile to the Abbasids who are still ruling in Baghdad, that's the first time you get records of famines in the city. And it's like so many things in this sort of economic history, it's a balance of probabilities. It's not a hard and fast thing. Things don't change overnight, but it's just a shift of emphasis, perhaps, that's interesting. But this story still remains to be written. Anybody got any spectacle? The history of the economy and the feeding and the economy of Baghdad is something that's an enormous amount of work still to be done on, an enormous amount of things we don't understand. Thanks for that.
Okay, we want to take one of the questions from online. There is a question by Simon Rafati. If any exports are known from Baghdad or of the period, it could be that much imported and exported goods. Yeah, it's like the Netherlands now, as such, the society was not consumer as it seemed. And another question by Will was about salt. Was there a trade in salt?
The first question is that we only hear perhaps one side of the story. We know about people coming to Baghdad. We know about imports into Baghdad, not just what I've been talking about, but people from all over the Muslim world coming to Baghdad to offer goods and services. And the records of the different quarters of Baghdad make this clear. It's importing people from Far East of Iran, from Andalus, and so on. People are coming to Baghdad because they've got goods and services to offer, and so on. But we hear very little in this period about people, about things made in Baghdad being exported. But that's an impression I get, and I keep stressing there's so much more to be discovered about this and so much more to be investigated about this. But it's the impression we get. In the 10th and 11th century, at the end of the 10th, into the 11th century, of course, we get a vast migration of Iraqi bureaucrats to Egypt, because that's where the jobs are. And that's where the money is, that's where artisans
and merchants.
And the making of glazed ceramics as well as lusterware and so on changes, abandons the lusterware makers. I think I got this right. Abandon Iraq and go and settle in Cairo. That's where the jobs are, that's where the money is, that's where people go. And I think this is it's a sign that things aren't in Baghdad are not quite as prosperous and vigorous as they have been before. The business about salt, I don't have an answer to this. The salt trade, I mean, it's not something I've even thought about before, which isn't very impressive, is it? But I mean, I think the salt trade is definitely something to be looked at. but I don't know what to do at the moment.
Well, there would be one small question about the textile industry. Could you tell us something more about the textile? Where was it based and who were involved in this, in the textile industry?
Well,
so embroidery, who did this?
Well, the textile industry is widely dispersed through the Middle East. The countries that we hear about over and over, in the earliest Islamic period, they're Yemeni textiles. And there's a lot in the lives of the Prophet about Yemeni textiles. The Kaaba was covered with Yemeni textiles until I think the later model early Abbasid times. And the Armenian textiles, very highly valued, and Kurdistani textiles as well. There were a wide variety of textile industries were established in a wide variety of places because they delivered different sorts of products. And that's partly a function of the dye stuffs, but it's partly a function of wools and silks that they had available to them. So it's widely diffused, but we find all of them in Baghdad. There's not much record of people in Baghdad producing fine textiles. There's lots of records of them buying them from other places and wearing them in the streets of Baghdad to show off their status and splendor and so on. But, of course, that has also, when the market in Baghdad declined, that's bad news for textile weavers in Armenia. Because the market, Nashakhi's history of Bukhara is a very interesting short bit about a special textiles that had been made, a special sort of textiles and silks that had been woven in Bukhara in the 8th and 9th centuries. By the 10th century, not only had the trade stopped because there was no market for them in Baghdad, but the memory of how these textiles had been made had now disappeared because nobody had done it for a couple of generations. And people read in the literature about what wonderful textiles these were, but nobody knew how to make them anymore. And that sort of, so the decline of the Baghdad market, in fact, has knock-on effects in lots of areas of the Middle East, particularly in the textile industry.
I think we have to round it off here, but fortunately we have still some opportunity to ask you questions over a drink. So please join us all in thanking him once more, and then in the back.